All right, JJ Zachariason, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a chance to dive into your rookie guide, and excellent as usual.
Thank you.
Wanted to just kind of dive into some rookie talk, go into these profiles. People, have been looking at Legendary Upside know that I've got a bunch of stuff already out on the rookies, and I've got more in the works. And it's a similar type of like analytical deep dive process. So you were the perfect first guest to have on the show to kind of get in the weeds on these prospects.
For sure, man.
Well, let's start at the top here because I don't think we need to go into a ton of detail on Bijan Robinson. He's the clear 101 in one quarterback rookie drafts, but I do think it's a little interesting to talk about where he lands among the quarterbacks because a pretty good quarterback class. And we've got high upside option in Anthony Richardson, Bryce Young. I think, as far as like a creator and a playmaker goes, very, very high end, obviously with the weight and the height. It's like how much fantasy upside does he have? You can get in the, kind of nitpick there. CJ Stroud didn't run enough, but he looks very athletic and a good thrower. So there's and all of these guys look, well, Bryce Young and CJ Stroud look like very strong bets to be starters for a while.
Yeah.
Richardson, who knows? But if it happens, I mean,
right.
You definitely wanted him as the 101. So there's some real opportunity cost in Superflex, but I think generally Robinson is seen as the 101 in Superflex. I want to get your thoughts on where he should go there.
Yeah, I do think he's the 101 in Superflex still, only because of the you say floor with a guy like Bijan, and by floor you're really referring to like an elite floor, which you just don't find very often, what you can't find very often. And I think from that perspective, like I always think whenever I'm sort of looking at when I'm ranking rookies and sort of approaching that aspect of things, I'm also looking at how I'm ranking guys just in startups in general, right? And I don't know about you, but like the way that I generally am approaching Superflex startups and the way that I'm ranking, I actually end up being higher on quarterbacks than a lot of people are. I know that, you and I are in plenty of dynasty leagues together, but like the leagues that we are in and that we do and the startups that we do are often incredibly quarterback heavy, and they're typically with other analysts, other experts, etc. And so the way that I sort of think about this is, okay, you have Bryce Young, you have CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson. I think that we would agree that Richardson has the highest upside of the group, just given what works in fantasy football. But it shouldn't shock anyone if in Superflex, any of those quarterbacks are ranked above Bijan Robinson, even after year one. I mean, like it's a distinct possibility that can happen, just given the way that, number one, the running back landscape is and how volatile that is. But also the fact that we have all of these quarterbacks in startups that are often going in round one. And I think that, we can lose sight of that pretty quickly and pretty easily because we're also looking at the downside. But you bring up, a Bryce Young and a CJ Stroud seemingly having a decent floor and seeming like pretty good prospects. I can at least like see the argument to go that route if you're looking for more safety in that like long-term solution at quarterback over Bijan. Would I do that? Probably not. I think that even in year two and beyond, in the short term, we're going to see Robinson most likely still ranked ahead of those guys, in startups. But, at the same time, the only non-quarterbacks that I really have like first round grades, if you will, on in a startup is like Justin Jefferson and Ja'Marr Chase. Otherwise, I'm basically going with a quarterback. And so if you want to lump those guys in, and that includes even like towards the end of the first and into the second, it's like the Dak Prescott types, like the players who, some people would view them maybe as like late seconds or something like that in a startup, but the longevity is still there. They're still going to be around for a while, and Dak at least can give us those spiked QB1 seasons. And I think that's sort of what we're probably looking at with a Young and a Stroud. And so I can at least make that argument again, in Superflex, you could go the quarterback route instead. And I honestly think, I mean, if there's someone in your league who sees or you think would see a pretty big gap between the 101 to the 102 or the 103 and even the 104 if you like Richardson, I think the Richardson combo is a little bit weird in Superflex versus one QB. Like to me, in one QB, it's very easy to just put Richardson as the QB1 just because who cares,
sure.
Yeah. Whereas in Superflex, you're looking for that like floor. You don't want to screw up that pick, all that kind of stuff. But regardless, if there's not a huge gap seen by your league mates, or if there is a huge gap, I should say, between the 101 to that quarterback tier, I don't think it's a crazy idea to see if you can sort of extract value from that 101 pick.
That makes sense. Yeah, in one quarterback leagues, you have to have Richardson one, I think. Like, I've gotten Justin Herbert off waivers in one quarterback dynasty leagues. I've gotten, I think I got Jalen Hurts off waivers, or a very, very late pick. So you got to be swinging for the fences there, but it gets a little more complicated in Superflex. I think I lean Bijan 101 as well in Superflex. Part of the reason being, like, it's hard for me to imagine, very many other running backs who people will even want next year.
Yeah.
Other than Bijan Robinson. Like, he might be one of like 3 running backs that's like,
Yeah.
it might be like him, Breece Hall. Like, Kenneth Walker might not even be that
I agree.
desirable next year if he doesn't catch any passes this year, right?
Exactly.
So the ability to get a season out of Bijan Robinson that could be quite valuable and then trade him potentially at a profit, it really provides kind of a unique opportunity at the position.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, and if anyone's doing rankings, dynasty rankings right now and such, I mean, you can see and you can just feel it while you're creating them, how awful the running back position is, and just like how uncomfortable you feel putting those guys. I mean, like a year ago, 2 years ago, we felt amazing about Jonathan Taylor, and just look how quickly that can change, and that dynamic falls. So I think Bijan Robinson's a better prospect than Jonathan Taylor was. Taylor was a great prospect, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, it's just that's just how the running back position works.
Yep. What are your thoughts on Robinson as a best ball pick right now, where he's going in kind of like the early second round? There's been Sam Sherman had an interesting thread on Twitter where he was saying, like, I don't really see a lot of great landing spots for him. He could kind of fall from here, and I think that's fair. But my take is sort of like, it's Bijan, dude.
Yeah, right. Like the issue is that we've made that excuse historically. We did the same thing with, I know that Breece Hall obviously tore his ACL, but like the same thing was being said about Breece Hall, which is the reason why we see a lot of these like rookie running backs, higher end rookie running backs fall in the dead zone a lot of times. And when that happens, they're actually those are actually the dead zone running backs that you should target, because those are the guys. The reason that they're in the dead zone is because of perceived competition combined with this unknown and this ambiguity around that player. We didn't know how good Breece Hall was going to be, or we didn't know even Jonathan Taylor when he broke out. We didn't know how good Jonathan Taylor was going to be. But we kind of did, like we still knew that they were very, very good prospects. And so their prices drop as a result. Now, the difference obviously with Bijan Robinson is the fact that he is looked at as an elite player immediately by the market, by everyone. But if you look historically, like if you look at rookie running backs that were drafted in the first 4-ish rounds, 3-ish rounds of redraft leagues, they exceed PPR points per game expectation at a very, very high rate. I mean, like you could go, I sent a tweet about this last week, but you could go like 10 deep, the top 10 rookie running backs by ADP over the last decade, and all of them but one, it was basically all of them except for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, ended up exceeding their expectation, based on their ADP, based on their draft cost. And, if you look at first rounders in particular, you get 3 of them. You have Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, and CEH. And, no offense to CEH truthers out there, but he's not in the same grouping as those other players as prospects. And so I actually think that we overstate, even in redraft, it's very easy to overstate landing spot. A dude like Bijan Robinson he could land pretty much anywhere and command a massive backfield share wherever he goes, unless the coaching staff is just completely ignorant, idiotic, or unless he goes like Indianapolis or something like that, which is just not going to happen. So I think that it really comes down to the fact that he's going to create that opportunity. I think where he's going right now is about where he should be going.
I do too. And I think, to me, the bad landing spots are the Bears and the Ravens, where just super mobile quarterback, assuming Lamar's there,
right?
Where you wouldn't have the pass catching part of his profile. But I want him to go to like a quote unquote bad landing spot, because he's ruining someone else's year, is the way I look at it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we spent more time on Bijan than I was thinking we would, but that's probably for the best, because there's like not that much going on in the kind of the middle class of this running back, the middle part of this running back class. Jahmyr Gibbs is a guy I like because his yards per route run is very strong. He's, the scouts and stuff think he's got all the elements of, the receiving profile that you're looking for. In that sense, Travis Etienne, people are a little shakier on him. in terms of like the film evaluation on the receiving, even though his numbers are pretty good. We're not getting that with Gibbs. Both sides seem to agree he's a really strong receiver, but you point out in your guide, size is a huge concern. Didn't have a ton of the carries. I never handled 33% of his team's rushing attempts in college, which, paired with the smaller size is definitely an issue. The thing that I came away feeling like with Gibbs is like, I'm still pretty bullish on him in Dynasty, but I'm worried that he's going to get pricey in best ball drafts once he goes in the second round, because I think he will. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to be paying like a 4th or 5th round price tag for a guy who's probably more of like a year 2, maybe even year 3 type of receiving breakout bet.
Yeah, I don't think that's wrong. I feel sort of the way I feel about Gibbs is sort of how I felt about Kenneth Walker last year, where like there's this one piece of his profile that's glaring and to my model and to my process and stuff that's glaring and that scares me a little bit, but it doesn't scare me off of the dude. Like Kenneth Walker last year had this big red flag with his receiving profile. And even after year 1, I don't know if we really got answers about that. I think there's still plenty of question marks with Walker's receiving profile, and with Gibbs, the big question mark. I mean, he didn't have like you said, he didn't have great like rushing production necessarily, but his receiving production, I mean, he's the best receiving back in this class, probably the best receiving back that we've seen in years out of the NFL or out of the NFL draft. But size does matter. I know that folks will look at certain thresholds and they'll say, oh, he's just under 200 pounds. And now all the analytics people are going to say, oh, he's under 200 pounds, therefore we got to avoid him. That's not really the way that I approach things. I mean, I do have weight as part of my model.
He's in the wrong bucket now.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's like, yeah, if he would have had an extra glass of milk that day, then he
I really wish he would have, though. Don't you wish he would have?
Yeah, exactly. It would have been nice for him to get to that 200. But no, so like even if you look at 210 pound players, running backs, there's actually a pretty big difference in how those guys produce, in fantasy. I did a quick newsletter to subscribers a couple weeks ago, looking at different weight classes at the running back position and essentially showing how well they did, during their first 3 years in the league. And if you look, basically I bucketed them out. So I looked at all running backs in my database, in my prospect database, which is all running backs that were drafted or went to the combine since 2011. So there's a lot of running backs in this overall database. And so I bucketed them out and I said, okay, here are the guys that are above 230 pounds. Here are the guys who are 220 to 229, 210 to 219, et cetera. So every 10 pounds, you get a different tier, right? And if you just were to look at how those players perform.
You are bucketing.
What's that?
You are bucketing these.
Yeah,
guys.
I am bucketing from this perspective. Yes, exactly. But if you were to look at sort of the distribution of players in these different buckets, you can see that the majority of them, there's like 8% of them are above 230 pounds. 5% of them are under 190 pounds. And then the bulk of them are, in between that like 200 to 220 range, 225 range, which is not surprising. But if you then layer on how frequently those players hit 10 plus PPR points in a season across their first 3 in the league, 12, 14, 16, there's pretty obvious distribution happening here where the smaller backs are not doing as well. Like for instance, of the 190 to 199 pound group, 7.5% of them had a double-digit PPR point per game season across their first 3 in the league, which is not very big because if you go up to the 200 to 209 group, you get to 25%. And then above that, you get to 31%. So there's a pretty drastic difference when you get to that like 210-ish, 205 pound range. And then, the comment back would be, okay, well, there's a bias here because obviously bigger running backs are getting drafted earlier. So the sample size that I'm working off of here is every running back that's entered the league essentially over the last decade. But a lot of these smaller backs are not being drafted early. So it's not really fair to compare the two. So what I did was I looked at running backs who were drafted. First off, I looked at their median draft pick, which showed that, guys who were below 190 had a median draft pick of 243, 190 to 199 had a median draft pick of 376. And then like the above 230 range, the median draft pick was 140. So it was like a very dramatic difference because these bigger backs are getting drafted earlier. But what I did was I leveled the playing field out and I looked at players who were picked between pick 33 and pick 100, essentially a day 2 pick. I didn't want to throw the day 1 guys in there because obviously we're not seeing, Devon Achane size backs being drafted in the first round. And even when you do that, even when you control for draft capital, there's a pretty significant difference when you're looking at these different tiers, especially not when you get to 200 pounds, but when you get to 210 pounds. That's really, to me, a huge cutoff if you were to have some sort of threshold to look at with these guys. Just as a for instance, if you're looking at that grouping of running backs that were drafted between pick 33 and 100, of the guys who were 210 to 219 pounds, 47% of them were able to get 14 plus PPR point per game season across their first 3 in the league. You go down by 10 pounds, the next tier, the 200 to 209 range, that goes from 47% to 15%. I mean, there's a drastic difference. Then you go down to the 190 to 199 range and you get 0%. There's literally never been, since 2011, there hasn't been a sub 200 pound back that's been at the combine or drafted that has given you a 14 that was drafted in the second or third round. That's given you a 14 plus PPR point per game. There hasn't even been one that's given you a double digit PPR point per game season. So basically what I'm saying is, I know that was a lot to like randomly take in, but basically what I'm saying is, I think there's a red flag here. It's very, very hard to find like legitimate comps for Jahmyr Gibbs. And I understand that there's some, like you could say, oh, he could be Chris Johnson or he could be Javid Best. But at the same time, it's like, do we really feel comfortable when we're digging through comps from 2008? You know, it's somewhat of a red flag. And you know, he still looks fine in my model. He's still a 93rd percentile guy, which is around where Kenneth Walker was last year. So he was still fine enough, but I just don't buy into like he's Alvin Kamara when Alvin Kamara was 15 pounds heavier than him. You know, I think that he's got more of like a Gio Bernard profile than he does an Alvin Kamara profile.
Yeah. Although like Gio Bernard, but much, much more explosive and fluid.
Yeah. I mean, mostly just from an on paper standpoint. Yeah. I mean, like he's better than what Gio Bernard is or was. And I think that teams are going to be able to be a lot more creative with a guy like Gibbs than they ever could be with a guy like Bernard. It's just more so like, I mean, look, bottom line is, if you're looking for like a sub 210 pound comp for him, again, 210, not 200, that really worked out at the next level, that was drafted highly over the last decade, it's really CMC. Like that's really, and I don't think he has that I mean, CMC was so good across the board that it's just hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say this for any running back, but it's hard for me to sit here and be like, Jahmyr Gibbs can have a CMC level impact.
I don't think that's very likely at all, because CMC at like 203 or 204, whatever he came in at, turned into a every down workhorse back, which is such a rare outcome for any back.
Right.
And the research that I've done for, the legendary running back seasons, looking for these guys who can win you your league in the early rounds, like that also pointed to 210 pounds as being really significant for goal line carries.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that if you want a guy who's going to turn in one of these massive seasons, they need to score a bunch of touchdowns.
Yeah.
And you're very unlikely to get the goal line carries. And I think that's, one of those things the NFL prefers, to have a big guy around the goal line. We've seen that. It took Austin Eckler years to get goal line work. He got it eventually, but it took a while.
That's the other thing too, is that I think when people hear me say these things about Gibbs, it's not really about how I feel about Gibbs. Like if I'm running a team, if I'm coaching a team, I don't really care if he's smaller, if he can work at the goal. Like Darren Sproles wasn't that bad at the goal line. Like there are guys that can be smaller that can still work at the goal line. I'm working off of what we've seen historically trends wise from these teams and how they operate. And generally speaking, just flat out how teams operate is they don't give these smaller backs the kind of workload that we want for fantasy football. It's not that I think that Gibbs is bad at all. It's just that my model is literally trying to predict how well they're going to do in fantasy. That's all I care about. And if a team is going to handle their volume differently because of that size, or because, they want to use them in a particular way, I think that we should at least, pay attention to that.
Okay, so if Gibbs had a tall glass of milk, maybe he's in a different bucket and he doesn't look quite so bad. Devon Achane would have needed a keg of milk to get anywhere near a good bucket in that analysis you just described. He's been a tough guy for me right now, because it's looking like he has a much stronger odds of being selected in the second round than, Zach Charbonnet has pretty good odds, but if you go past Charbonnet, it's like any of these guys could be 6th round picks. Like I don't feel confident that, even like Tank Bigsby, Kendre Miller, any of these guys, I feel like everyone has their favorite among that group. they all really don't have locked in draft capital. And Achane seems to have locked in draft capital, which makes him like more appealing to me, I think, than any of those other guys individually. But like as a group, I kind of want the field. And so like ranking him has been pretty tough because the weight concern for him is he doesn't have the elite receiving profile like Gibbs. Gibbs is like, yeah, he's not going to play every down and he's going to be limited in what he does. I'm like, yeah, but what he does is probably be really, really special. I don't necessarily feel that way about Achane.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you look at my prospect model database, there's 19 running backs who have been below 190 pounds in that database. This is since 2011. None of them have had 100 or more carries in a season. So like, it's just the way that it's just the way that these coaches and staffs use these running backs. I think the best like guy in that group was like a Tariq Cohen, right? Like someone that was able to do a lot as a pass catcher.
And who's a receiver, yeah.
Yeah, to me, Tariq Cohen is more like a Deuce Vaughn than he is someone like Devon Achane. And so, yeah, I mean, like I agree with you from the perspective of like where we're at right now at the end of March. And I got a lot of questions about this with my rankings after I published the prospect guide, was that people were like, oh, you seem really low on these running backs because I thought this was supposed to be a good running back class, but it's not that. It's that I think after the draft, we're just going to have a better idea of which one of those running backs did slip to the 6th round and which one didn't. Because we have, like you said, there's like Tank Bigsby, Sean Tucker, Chase Brown. Like there's all these guys who could easily be day 2 guys. And if they are day 2 guys, then we're going to feel a lot more comfortable with them and ranking them.
And we'll know the landing spots. Like I think you don't want to get carried away with landing spot as we talked about with Bijan, but in this group behind Achane, I think landing spot's going to matter a lot.
I agree. You know? Yeah, I agree. And you know, to your question straight up about Achane, like I'm way lower than the market on Achane. It's literally because of size. And I know that sounds like crazy to people, but like right now, like he had a pretty good production profile overall. Like it wasn't really horrible. And you know, he competed with Isaiah Spiller, and say what you want about Spiller, but it's still an NFL caliber player that he was competing with, you know, during his second to last season. But even still, I mean, the size is a massive, massive concern when we're not trying to predict how well these guys are going to just be as players. I think Achane, you know, him going in the 2nd or 3rd round, like let's say he goes late 2nd, like I understand it from a real football perspective to some degree because he's such an explosive player, but I just don't know if he's going to be a 15 plus touch per game player. I would almost guarantee he's not going to be that because you're going to have to see a lot of volume on the ground in order to get there. And as a result, I just don't see the ceiling for a guy like Achane. I think you can see it more in a PPR format with a guy like Gibbs. Obviously, you know, Gibbs can be like a better DeAndre Swift or something like that. But like with Achane, it's really, really hard to find that ceiling and to see where that ceiling is coming from. I mean, his comps in my model were Isaiah Pede, Tyler Ervin, and Justin Jackson. And part of that is there's just
I also got Irvin. I don't love that.
Yeah. Part of that is like there's just a lack of players that are that size in general that I'm looking through. But part of it too is that we just don't. I mean, this is what Achane kind of is. I think Irvin makes a lot of sense, honestly. Like it's not like it's that crazy of a comp to make. You know, is he electric? Is he explosive? Is he really fun? Yeah, he's a super fun player, but I just don't know if he's going to be super fun for fantasy.
How close were those comps? Because I didn't get a lot of close comps for Gibbs, but I got like no close comps for Achane, which in some ways, given that he's like such a weird profile, I actually at that point, I want that. Like, because anyone, to your point, like anyone that he comps to in past NFL history wasn't successful for fantasy because no one's gotten 100 carries. So
right.
It's better, right, if he doesn't have any close comps at least.
100%. Both Achane and Gibbs were very difficult for. I mean, the comp wise, the percent match was not nearly as good as what I got from some other backs. Like some other backs are just like a very, very. I mean, even Deuce Vaughn didn't have very good matches, obviously, because he's just such a unique player in terms of size and production profile and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, like they're not like exact, but I do think that, you know, it's you do want to embrace that volatility with these kinds of players, as you're mentioning, because obviously we haven't seen it happen before, but then at the same time, we haven't seen it happen before. And that's still a little bit concerning. If you're going to have to like spend up like that's why I just feel better about like Deuce Vaughn versus a Devon Achane, because you're going to be able to get Vaughn way later in your rookie drafts because people just don't care because he's so small. But I actually think that they can make a similar impact from a fantasy perspective, like strictly a fantasy perspective. And so I'd rather wait a round and a half, especially when you're talking like mid second round draft capital in terms of rookie draft picks to like,
Yeah.
no one cares about third and fourth rounders. They just don't matter in dynasty. So like the opportunity cost is way, way lower if you're going the Deuce Vaughn route than the Devon Achane route.
You're in a lot of leagues, I think, with Davis Maddox, so you might be spending a second to secure Deuce Vaughn in those.
That's true.
Well, okay, so I want to ask you about in a couple minutes. I want to ask you about some of the guys kind of in this big tier, because it seems like we're in agreement that there's this big group of guys, and we don't know right now, but some of them are going to be really good, and they're going to be hits, and we're going to be interested in post draft, and 2 years from now, we're going to be excited about these guys. Some of them probably. So I want to get some of your favorite guys from this big tier, but I first want to ask you about a guy that I think I'm quite a bit higher on than you. And that's DeWayne McBride, who's another one of these big red flag guys, but it's the other end of the spectrum. He's not that big, weighted in 209, I believe. But an awesome rusher, super elusive. The issue is that he may never have caught a pass in his entire life. It's that one small issue. We could just combine him and Jahmyr Gibbs. We'd have 2 Bijan level prospects in this class. But I guess the thing for me is that I wonder if there's a floor below which you can't be any worse. Is he really that much worse as a receiver in the NFL? As a prospect, he's yes, he is worse than Kenneth Walker as a receiver, but as an NFL player, because he can pass block okay, is he really that much worse than what Kenneth Walker is going to give you in terms of profile? And he looks like a pretty exciting rusher. My concern is he's had a hamstring injury. He has not yet run the 40. If you watch the highlights, he's getting tackled from behind repeatedly. Yeah. So I'm pretty worried that he might be a 4.7 guy. But I think if he runs a 4.65, goes in the 4th round, I think he's pretty interesting. And he's going right now in underdog drafts in the 20th round. So he's completely free.
Yeah, I think from that perspective, it's fine, right? It's totally fine. But I do think that a player like McBride, he's one of those players that I don't think you're going to regret ranking him low, if that makes sense. Because I don't think that the receiving profile that he has, which is the 7th worst in my model, that my model's ever that's in terms of best season reception share, which is one of the metrics that the model looks at. But his best season reception
yards
share
per route run changed my conditional formatting.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everyone's colors just completely changed.
Everyone else looks great now.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, his best season reception share was 1.7%. He caught 5 passes throughout his time at UAB, which is just it's rough. It's just straight up rough. Size profile is good. It's there. But we've seen these what I really look for when I'm prospecting through data like this is I love the players who are able to give you, some semblance of a receiving profile, whether it's in reception share, whether you're looking at yards per route run, what have you, some semblance of a receiving profile with that size, which is part of the reason why my model liked Isaiah Pacheco more than others did last year, because he had the offense that he played in sucked. The offensive line was horrible. His receiving, his efficiency wasn't that great or anything like that, but he was at least getting the ball a lot through the air. His best season reception share was still in the double-digit percentage, which is not easy to find from bigger bodied backs. And so he was an easy guy to then say, okay, I'm gonna at least, my model's gonna like him a little bit more than how others view him. So he seems like a target. Whereas this is just not the case with McBride. You're just not getting that receiving profile with him. But I'm not gonna hate on anyone for throwing that 20th round dart or spending a 4th round rookie pick on a player like this when, maybe you can get some spiked weeks from maybe he turns into a goal line back and he's able to be that early down plotter. I don't think though that he's I maybe someone would be thinking right now, a Tyler Algier from last year. Algier had a pretty good, Algier was another guy last year who had a decent receiving profile, was a bigger bodied back, and then was able to do what he did as a rookie. I don't see that.
He was more like a Cam Akers type of he can do it. The receiving stuff, he's not great at it, but it's not a problem.
Right. And to me, the receiving stuff when we're prospecting is not just can you catch passes? It's a sign of talent, right? These teams are trying to get these guys the ball in a lot of different ways, which is why we see signal from guys who are punt and kick returners at wide receiver, even running back in college. And so, I think that it's important to look at it from that perspective too. It's okay, well, why was DeWayne McBride catching 1 pass per year? Like what is the reason for that? Is it because, they just gave him so much work on the ground, which is sort of kind of the Kenneth Walker dilemma, or is it because he's just not very good? And I think that could be the outcome for him.
Yeah, that seems fair. All right, let me get some of your favorite of these, this big tier of running back. And I guess curious also on your thoughts of like how these guys compare with Zach Charbonnet, who kind of is like the ideal version of these guys, and that he can catch passes. He's I would say also kind of in that Algier mode where he's perfectly capable as a receiver, not like doesn't pop as a receiver, but he's fine. And decently big, not as big as I thought he might be, but good size. Draft capital looks potentially very good. Second round in play. Third round looks very likely. Unlikely to fall. Maybe he falls to the fourth, but he's not going to have a big slide, I don't think. These other guys, draft capital questions, but they do profile for the most part pretty similarly in terms of that, like good but not great receiving profile, good rushers. So who jumps out to you?
Yeah, look, I actually think Charbonnet, like my gap between Gibbs to Charbonnet is probably smaller than a lot of analysts. Like I think that Charbonnet, again, this is coming from the perspective of fantasy, right? Like I understand that Gibbs is more electric and just like the better player that I would rather have on my real football team. But from the perspective of fantasy, you have the size and you have the combo of being a 3-down back in Charbonnet if a team's willing to do that. And if they get him in the second round, if that capital's there, you have to assume that they're looking to do that, right? Right now he's projected to go in round 2. And if that happens, this is in my prospect guide. Here's a list of the other 4 210 plus pound running backs who were drafted in the second round since 2011 with a best season reception share above 12%. So big bodied guy who had a reception share above 12%. You had Daniel Thomas, which was a miss, but you also had Le'Veon Bell, Joe Mixon, and DeAndre Swift. And then if you go beyond that and you look at the third round players within that same criteria, again, third rounders, I mean, there's a lot of misses at running back in the third round. You get Kareem Hunt, Alvin Kamara, David Johnson, Charles Sims. That's a throwback. DeMarco Murray, Zach Moss, Keyshawn Vaughn, Antonio Gibson, and Rashad White. So there's a lot of, all things considered, when you're looking at day 2 guys, round 3 guys, these are the kinds of of running backs that I'm really trying to target in my drafts, because when you get that combo of pass catcher with size, that means that they have that 3-down potential. So I'm very, very high on Zach Charbonnet. I think that if for whatever reason we see a closer gap in draft capital between Gibbs and Charbonnet, I'm not going to say that I would necessarily do this, but I wouldn't be shocked if I have Charbonnet ahead of Gibbs after the draft. Like if it's close enough, like if Gibbs goes, it depends on where they go just based on how the model looks at things. But, let's say Gibbs goes like 45th overall and Charbonnet is like 53rd or something like that. Like I will be fine putting Charbonnet above Gibbs, rankings post draft.
I'm going to caveat this take because if you don't have a liquid dynasty league, do not do this. But there is like maybe something to the idea too of like you don't even necessarily have to 100% like a guy more if you're like, look, he's probably going to have the better rookie year. And maybe I can take Charbonnet, trade off of him after, because he does profile as someone that could just like get a bunch of touches down the stretch as a rookie and be very valuable after his rookie year, where Gibbs to me looks like he's probably going to have like an okay rookie year. And then we're all going to be hoping and praying it happens in year 2. And then who knows?
Which is similar to like a Swift, like what we've hoped with Swift and that we think exists with Swift. But I think that's sort of like the archetype. Yeah. That's sort of like the archetype that we're looking at with Gibbs, whereas Charbonnet is like, he could just be the dude. Like he could just see, that like 80% backfield share, like just an insane backfield share and stuff wherever he ends up going.
J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers came up as comps for me, which I think is exciting. And those are guys who are, again, kind of in that similar thing of like Dobbins hasn't really been used as a receiver as a pro, but that's not because of any limitations of him, I don't think.
Yeah.
Well, what about the guys below that? So maybe you do see a bigger gap between those guys and Charbonnet then.
Yeah, I mean, like right now it's just easier to say I'm going to get Charbonnet because I think we feel most confident that he's going to go day 2. Whereas once you get after Charbonnet, you're like, okay, you got Sean Tucker, who Sean Tucker on paper looks great, but then you look at some of like the way that film guys look at him and some of his like receiving grades and stuff like that, and it looks way worse.
And the medical red flag that he hasn't worked out yet. I don't
Yeah.
know how nervous to be about that, but I don't
Right.
love it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like he at least like if his athleticism is there and that like he has like a good profile, like more, more of
does.
that like objective statistical profile. So I don't mind Tucker. Chase Brown is someone who I'm a little bit lower on than since I published the prospect guide, just to be honest. But his age is kind of a concern. But he is one of the most athletic running backs in this class. I do care about athleticism way more at running back than I do a wide receiver. And his profile is good too. I mean, he's another like decent sized back who kind of does it all or could do it all. So, and then I put Tank Bigsby in that same group. Bigsby really comped well for me to DeMarco Murray. And if you look at guys who have that 210 plus pound frame that hit a 15% reception share, and you look at the guys who didn't in that same range, same projected range where Bigsby's going, there's a big edge to be had among the guys who are able to hit that reception share mark, at his size. So he's pretty interesting to me. And then I think there's a couple guys like I really, I've warmed up to Kendre Miller more and more.
He's tough because he looks like he should be. He looks like he's like a giant version of Aaron Jones or something when you watch him run.
Yeah.
But he's receiving stuff like his yards per hour is not good.
Not good.
I'm actually worried he's a 2-down guy.
I totally agree with you. That's the biggest concern with me. It's good though that he was able to, I mean, he played with Zach Evans and was more efficient than him, within that same offense. And then, in that same sort of like vein is Izzy Abanikanda from my alma mater at Pitt. He has a decent profile, but he didn't run at the combine. He can blaze. I mean, the dude is very, very fast. And
Miller,
I think that his size speed combo, if that were to be displayed at the combine, if it had been, he would be higher in dynasty draft, mock drafts, etc. right now than he currently is. And that's, I know that it's not Pitt bias, I promise. It's just the honest to God truth that he's a very, very fast dude and he's got the size, and his profile, looks a lot like Kendre Miller just in general. Like it's not like super unlike Miller's. He has a little bit better of a receiving profile too.
Yep.
So I think Abanikanda is kind of a decent sleeper right now.
Yeah, my film evaluation is non-existent, but when I watched Abanikanda, I get excited. And he looks like he cuts, like I'm like, this seems like it would fit well in a Shanahan type system. Like that's one of the, like, if he goes to Miami, like 4th round to Miami, I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm very in.
Yeah. He's got the breakaway speed though. Like I mean, last year
looks like Mostert to me a little bit.
Yeah, he just, exactly. Like he can generate those massive plays. I mean, maybe that's something that people would want and to focus on in best ball, what have you. But like he can absolutely generate those plays. Maybe they won't be predictable year one, but they're definitely there.
He's basically free in best ball as well. He's like 19th, 20th round. He's someone I haven't gotten a ton of exposure to. Before I release this podcast, I'm probably going to draft a couple drafts and get some more. I was going to be simultaneously drafting like 4 drafts to get some Izzy.
Yeah.
Anyone else that jumps out to you from that class?
One more guy is probably Evan Hall. And the reason I bring him up is because I'm a sucker for this profile. He's just someone who's
getting drafted. I've seen some low draft.
Right. That's the problem. I mean, like he has such a good receiving profile that I think that hypothetically he could find the field immediately and be a 3rd down kind of guy, but he's got weight. I mean, he's got size. Like and if you look at him, like the dude is jacked. Like he's a very, very big running back, an athletic running back. So I think that he's one of those players. I mean, to be fair, his number 1 comp was John Kelly, and I loved John Kelly coming out like 5 years ago or whatever. But he fits that mold sort of. One of his comps was Brandon Bolden for me, which I know doesn't excite people. I get it, but I think he's more athletic than what we get from a Brandon Bolden type. And Bolden's someone, again, who played that 3rd down role, obviously played a lot of special teams too. But I think Evan Hall could play that 3rd down role, maybe year 1, and then see if something can build off of that in the right environment.
Yeah, you could do worse than Brandon Bolden for a super late round comp. He's someone that jumps out to me too. I'm really worried about where he ends up getting drafted, or if he even does get drafted. Okay, I want to ask you about kind of the like this year's Bijan Robinson, the guy who's like, it's going to happen. Doesn't matter whether we like it or not. Coaches are going to like Roschon Johnson.
Yeah.
Do you feel the same?
Yeah, I mean, like I think of all the players. Again, I'm coming at this from an analytical perspective, and I try to approach my work with a lot of nuance because I think it's just important because this stuff is not very easy to be like super precise with. And obviously, Roschon Johnson's playing behind the best running back prospect that we've seen since Saquon, and so he's not going to have a good production profile. And so, and that's that. You should look at that more subjectively. Then he doesn't look great in my model. He doesn't look horrible, but he doesn't look great in my model. And if you look at some of the metrics that he's produced, I mean, not a lot of guys have done well with those metrics. The only and I think this is actually a fair comp for him too, but the one guy who produces poorly, if you will, from a production standpoint as Roschon, who ended up being good in fantasy was Chris Carson, who I think is probably like the high end, like the solid comp for him. But again, to your point, about Evan Hall, when you're looking at guys who, I mean, Roschon's rising, so maybe he ends up going day 2 or something like that. But, if you look at guys who are not the high end picks, and you can find a comp that is reasonable and strong, that's something that you can latch onto and just look for that upside. And I think Roschon at least has that, given the fact that he's huge. I mean, he's 219 pounds. He's got that going for him. And even, before Bijan, he had a good receiving profile, the 1 year that he played without him. So I like, there's at least like some semblance of something going on there with Roschon analytically, that I think I'll probably be around at market with Roschon, despite the fact that, I'm looking at this from a statistical perspective and his numbers just weren't very good.
I feel the same way, although he's starting to move up in best ball drafts to the point that I'm not that in. He's going, I don't know, around like pick 160 or something like that, which is okay, but I don't know. So he used to be a little cheaper, but with him, and Davis Maddock has made this point that if Bijan Robinson's coming off the field so that he can come on and pass protect, that's probably good. And I actually went and checked the pass blocking grades, and of all the running backs this year that have a realistic chance of being selected day 2, he is the top graded pass blocking running back. So that part of it checks out. If you think, okay, he's big enough to be on the field all the time, he pass blocks really well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not the most exciting type of profile statistically, but potential 3-down back who's going pretty cheaply.
Yeah. I mean, I think that he too, like, you mentioned Brian Robinson. Like, I would argue that he's like more exciting than Brian Robinson was last year. I understand like the idea that this guy that like no one's really like in love with, and then he just kind of walks into volume and all that kind of stuff. But I do think there's at least some juice there, is what I'm saying with Roschon. Like,
it could be Miles Sandersy maybe with he's stuck behind Saquon.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think the athleticism's there, and he's got the size to be able to handle a big workload. That goes a long way.
All right, let's move to wide receiver. It's an interesting wide receiver class, but not a great wide receiver class. And you had a great thread that was comparing this to the last 3 years. I view this very similarly. The last 3 years have spoiled us. This isn't a terrible wide receiver class. This is just a normal wide receiver class. It's the last 3 years that haven't been normal. And I don't know. I mean, like, to get a Jackson Smith and Jigba, a Jordan Addison, a Quentin Johnston, those feel like pretty solid top 3 before this past year, but it does feel disappointing, let's say, to have this class after the last 3 years.
Yeah, and especially, I'm not as into the college scene until like January hits every year when I start prospecting and stuff, but I know, I'm still loosely following things, and I know that this class was looked at as supposed to be very, very good, just a couple of years ago or even last year. And then just basically every higher end player. I mean, JSN, he's injured. Jordan Addison transfers and doesn't do that much. I mean, Kayshon Boutte, he's not doing he didn't do anything. He hasn't done anything since his freshman year. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that went wrong for the higher end wide receivers. And then the result is this, which, like you said, it's not a bad class, but it's just not nearly as good as what we've seen over the last few years.
It also has, I don't think it does not have a lot of guys later on that I'm particularly excited about potentially bubbling up and saving the class. Like, it seems to have a true consensus top 6. Yeah. We have the same top 6. I haven't seen anyone else have a different top 6. That's not something I want in a class like this. I would love if they had a consensus top 3, and then it's like, who knows?
Yeah. Sort of like running back right now.
Yeah, like running back. I would prefer that. Yeah. Marvin Mims, though, is a guy that jumps out to me as like potentially pretty interesting. He doesn't like check the boxes in terms of a breakout. He never broke out by a 30% dominator rating, but he was like pretty productive throughout. He was an early declare. He had one good year with a really good yardage share. He had another year with a really good touchdown share. He never did it at the same time, so we never got the breakout. But he's someone that in a class where I'm just like, please someone bubble up and become, kind of that true sleeper type. He's that guy for me, although to be honest, like the high end outcome I'd be looking for is like a year 2 or 3 emergence, maybe like a Chris Godwin type of thing where it's like, eventually he's great. Early on, you're not getting much.
Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing with him, he had like insane depth of targets in college. They were 17, 17.6, and 15.4 during his 3 years, at Oklahoma. But he was insanely productive there. One of the guys that he gets down the field very, very well. And I think that's why his comps in my model is 3 comps. Number 1 was KJ Hamler, who I don't think we'll ever know whether KJ Hamler is good or not. And then Isaiah Ford was another one who was a big play guy who could stretch a field. The last one though was Jerry Jeudy, which was fairly interesting, for Mims. But I mean, like of the guys that are maybe not in that group, I could definitely see him, being one of the players that ends up standing out and is able to make that jump. But similar, my stuff was seeing the same thing that you were, where like his numbers were above average across the board.
Yeah.
Like they were never like absurd where you're like, holy crap, this guy could be like unbelievable. His best season yards per team pass attempt was 2.66, which is fine, but it's not like this unbelievable number. And that's one that my model looks at pretty heavily. But he is an early declare guy and he had a freshman year breakout, right? So like those 2 things, it's like, okay, this there's something there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like, this is another potential like threshold situation, like breakout age. That's a threshold based thing.
Right.
And there's a couple different thresholds, but if you're like, he never hit the 30% one, he came pretty close a couple times. Maybe that's good. Maybe we're in an era of fantasy football where like that's a target profile because we're like the market's going to be too low on him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. My model for breakout is usually looking at 20% rather than the 30%.
Okay. Yeah. Well, with that let me ask you if there's anybody else that kind of jumps out to you as potentially bubbling up as a sleeper type.
Yeah, there's one dude who I've gone on my podcast. I said this last week, and I'm now going to be leading the charge with Jayden Reed. So Jayden Reed, I
think Reeves is on him in a big way too.
Yeah, I think he might be too. Yeah. Reed is really interesting because so he started his collegiate career at Western Michigan, right? At Western Michigan, and as we all know, Western Michigan over the last 2 years has produced 2 second-round wide receivers, one of them being D. Eskridge 2 years ago, which was an absurdly stupid pick. And then last year being Sky
really
Moore. And it's still ridiculous that D. Eskridge went in the second round of the NFL draft, but I'll move on. So he was at Western Michigan, and at Western Michigan during Jayden Reed's freshman year, D. Eskridge was a junior and he outproduced D. Eskridge as a freshman, and D. Eskridge was a junior. And then Reed transferred to Michigan State, and when he transferred, he lost a year just because of transfer rules. And so then he played the final 4 seasons or however long he played at Michigan State after that 1 year at Western Michigan. But the crazy thing is that so he plays his freshman year at Western Michigan, he leaves, and then Sky Moore enters at Western Michigan. So they didn't play together, but Sky Moore was there the year after Jayden Reed was. It was an identical offense. I mean, the same guys were there, same quarterbacks were generally there. And Jayden Reed had a better freshman season yards per team pass attempt rate than Sky Moore did. And then on top of that, Reed goes to Michigan State, was fairly productive at Michigan State. He did it all too. He's one of those guys where like my model doesn't have punt and kick return stuff in it because it's hard to like really model for that. But it's one of those like additive things that if these guys did that, then it's a signal for me. So he did everything. I mean, he saw touches on the ground too, but he was returning kicks, returning punts, and he had a pretty good receiving profile there too. So I think that if you bring that all together, and the other thing too, the statistical comparables in my model for him, number 1 was Cam Phillips, which isn't great. Another one, the third one was Tylan Wallace, which isn't great. But the second one was Stephon Diggs for Jayden Reed.
Okay.
And so I'm like, all right, well, if we're talking about so I've seen him rising a little bit. Like he might be a day 2 pick. Like there's a possibility that he's a day 2 pick, but even if he's a day 3 pick, if you can find a guy like that with a Stephon Diggs comp, that's someone that you should probably be paying attention to. And then, on top of that, he has all these other things going for him, like what he did at Western Michigan and stuff. So I think Jayden Reed is, I'm way, way higher than the market on him, like way, way higher. Okay. He's definitely someone that I'm targeting heavily.
So Rich Rebar, I said, was in on him. He was on Ship Chasing and mentioned him. I'm not sure if he was actually in on him or he was demanding that we be in on him given his statistical profile. So yeah. I'm glad to see someone picked it up and ran with it because he does have a pretty interesting statistical profile. I guess it's tough, like with him, like you'd love to see him be an early declare, with the Diggs comp.
Yep.
But to your point about losing a year transferring, like what are the chances then in the next year he's going to really get on the NFL's attention?
Right.
So
the other thing too is that this class, as we know, is just filled with like geriatrics, right? Like we just have like 23 plus year old players all over the place. So like it's one of those situations where it's tough to be beggars can't be choosers when, we're looking at the context of this class. Would I be as in on Jayden Reed in a previous class? Maybe not. But I do think that there's at least a lot going for him that he's worthy to call out as a sleeper.
That's how I feel about Zay Flowers. So I feel like last year I would have been like, come on, the 4-year guy, he's small. Zay Flowers, give me a break. Now I'm like, clear wide receiver 4. I'm pretty excited about him at the end of the first round in Superflex.
Right.
So I don't know what a difference a year makes, I guess. But he has kind of I've come around on him outside of some of the big, overarching takeaways of, 4-year prospect, not the biggest guy. He's not even that tall. He's just, I think he's 182, but he's like 5'9". under 5'10". Yeah. So that I don't love, but then he was producing his yards downfield. I don't think he's like, he had some rushing yards as a freshman, but I think he's a legit downfield wide receiver. I think he can, there's a good chance anyway that he's going to be able to play outside in the NFL, be more of kind of an intermediate guy than I think a true deep threat. Give him, 4.4 240 is good, not great for his size, but he actually looks pretty interesting to me despite some red flags.
I totally agree. One of the things that I think, the fantasy community doesn't pay attention to enough is like just slot rates and like how they work and like what they mean and all that kind of stuff. Like if you're a full-time slot guy, but you're not on the field in 2 wide receiver sets, that's a problem, right? Like that's an issue. Like you don't want to be Cole Beasley or something like that, where you're like only going to be playing the slot. You'll never play in 2 wide sets. That's an issue. That's the Elijah Moore problem from last year, right? Like where he was only on the field in those kinds of sets. Whereas with Zay Flowers, you can project him to maybe play the slot at the NFL level, but he only ran 33% of his routes from the slot last year. I mean, he played on the outside. He played on the perimeter. Like you said, he can get down the field. To me, that can translate. And we've seen in recent memory, Elijah Moore is actually another player in recent memory who was smaller, but was able to play the outside. I mean, his rookie season, the vast majority of his snaps were on the outside, were on the perimeter. He actually played way more in the slot this past year than he did in year 1. So I don't think that his size, I'd rather have him be, beefier and bigger and still be doing these things. But I would argue that him doing these things is the result of his size and the result of him, being in that smaller frame and able to stretch the field and stuff. Is he someone that like I'm head over heels for? Not really. I mean, he's a 92nd percentile guy in my model, which isn't bad, but I like guys to get in like the 95th percent range, which is where elite guys typically end up coming from. And then from a comp perspective, it's not easy to find like decent comps for him. Like Philip Dorsett was one for me. Marcus Wheaton was one. And then Randall Cobb was one.
Marcus Wheaton.
Yeah. So like there's some,
I tried to talk people into Kendall Wright. This morning I had a newsletter post go out and I was like, it's not as bad as it looks.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So like, I think that he, and then obviously, we didn't even mention really the age thing. Like he's going to be 23 years old in September. So like there's that too. But I do think that within the context of this class, great route runner, pretty good production for the most part. I think that he makes sense pretty firmly as like a top 4, top 5 wideout in this class.
Yeah. Well, that point you made about guys playing in the slot, that's one I've been kind of hammering for Jackson Smith and Jigba, where I feel like, do people realize that CeeDee Lamb played over 90% of his snaps in the slot as a rookie? Do people realize he played over 60% of his snaps last year in the slot? It doesn't matter if he plays in the slot a bunch of times, as long as he's out there running all the routes, which
Exactly.
I think Jackson Smith and Jigba will be out there running all the routes. And so I've tended to think that like the Amon-Ra St. Brown comp, certainly plenty of upside if he can replicate that, but there's not great odds of even a very good prospect replicating what Amon-Ra St. Brown's doing the way he's doing it. I feel like he has other paths than that. I think he can, be kind of a guy who's out there for every route, playing mostly in the slot, but he doesn't have to just be like a slot target dominator the way Amon-Ra St. Brown is.
Yeah, but that's also the problem with like and I'm pulling up one player right now in my database because I think it's important because I think he's like a decent comp, but like I think it's important the way that we speak about this and the way that just, analysts and the community speaks about like slot guys, because I think that people then take that as like these guys are only playing in the slot or like that's what they can do
right.
or that's what they do. But like a perfect example, I think with JSN is Keenan Allen, where Keenan Allen, if you look throughout his career, 64% slot rate, 62%, 54. So he's like playing over 50% of his running 50% of his routes or more from the slot for half of his career, but he's still playing on the perimeter too. Like he's still able to do that. Yep. And I think that with JSN, a team would be, there might be teams out there that see JSN as only a slot guy. They're just not going to draft him in the first round then. If that's how they view a player like JSN, if a team's going to draft JSN in the top 15, there is no doubt in my mind that they see him as a perimeter threat. It's just that when they have a 3 wide set, they're going to throw him in the slot because he's a technician there and he'll be able to dominate there. So, my comps for him, analytic comps were Juju was his first one. Again, I don't think that he's as slotty as Juju is. Ja'Marr Chase and Garrett Wilson were the other two. So like you have players who, again, I mean, I don't think he's Ja'Marr Chase. I don't think we're looking at that with JSN, but if you think about like where Juju is, what Garrett Wilson did, and like I don't see JSN as the same type of player as like a Chris Olave or Garrett Wilson per se, but I think it just is like a hat tip to the idea that he can play on the perimeter.
Yeah, Justin Jefferson came up for me. So he's going to be a mix between Justin Jefferson and Ja'Marr Chase. That's
no big deal.
That's the takeaway here. Yeah. No, I that's how I view him too. And I love that point that like if a team's taking him in the mid first, they're going to play him on the outside a decent amount. That's why first round draft capital is so valuable, right? It's a team who believes in you, who's taking you. I was kind of shocked by this. I was looking up relative to another prospect, actually, some comps, and Tyler Lockett has played 50% of his career snaps out wide.
Yeah.
Which I guess isn't that shocking considering it's Seattle. It's not like the most 11 personnel type of offense, but it's still Tyler Lockett. It would surprise me.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like if you can find a player who's at least going to be out there in these 2 wide sets, that's all that you should care about from a fantasy perspective, because like again, with JSN, a team is not going to draft him in round 1 and let him sit on the bench while Nico Collins and whoever is playing for, like if Houston gets him or something at 12, like it just is not logical. It's not a meaningful thing to do. So I mean, like I think that people would be surprised when they see sort of how frequently some of these like smaller wide receivers are really playing in that area of the field. What you really want is a guy who can play the perimeter and who's out there in 2 wide sets and then can take advantage of those matchups in the slot whenever they do have those, similar to like a CeeDee Lamb when they have those 3 wide sets.
100%. 2 guys that I do have slot concerns with in this class are Josh Downs and Jalen Hyatt. Hyatt, for different reasons. Hyatt played like exclusively in the slot basically, but as a deep threat. He ran a bunch of go routes. A huge percentage of his yards came from go routes. So again, I'm not a tape guy. I don't know how he is as a route runner really, but that doesn't seem like me. If you're running go routes from the slot, they're probably not like the most polished route runner. You're going to have to go to the outside now, Jalen Hyatt. He's not that big. He didn't run. He's not Tyquan Thornton. He ran a 4.4. He doesn't have truly elite speed in a pretty small package. The like projection part of it really scares me with him. And then Downs is sort of the reverse, where I'm worried maybe he is that guy who only plays 70% of snaps, runs the 75% route rate, something like that, where he is just limited to the slot.
Yeah, I agree with both those takes. I mean, with Jalin Hyatt, he didn't have the best breakout age and such. I mean, he had good final season production. The problem I have with Hyatt is if you look at him analytically and objectively within my model, and that's how I'm pulling these comps, it looks almost identical to Jameson Williams. Like it's because you have 2 years of nothing, and then you have this 3rd-year breakout. But I would argue that Williams at least has more of a backbone as to why those 2 years were the way that they were.
Yeah.
And so like
because Cedric Tillman is the argument for Hyatt.
Right.
It's not as strong as Jason, Olave, and Garrett Wilson.
Exactly. So like I'm not saying that he is that. I'm just, it's more so that like that's probably the higher end piece where we're at. My top comp for Hyatt was Nelson Aguilar. So take that for what it's worth. I think that's what we could see out of him, honestly, at the NFL level. But yeah, the concerns are definitely there. I mean, there's a lot of film people too who just talk about that. Like he really ran against defenses where there was like no press. I mean, it was just literally him not seeing corners even remotely close to him at the line of scrimmage, because they're obviously playing for his speed. But he was able to not. I mean, there wasn't that much contact that he had to like deal with, and he has a smaller frame, so that's a little bit of a concern then as he translates then, to the NFL. And then, yeah, Josh Downs, I think I have the exact same concerns with. I mean, I had the concerns to some degree with Elijah Moore coming out, and that's Josh Downs' top comp for me is Elijah Moore. Tyler Lockett is also one of my comps for Josh Downs. And you just
came up as a comp for me too. That's why I was looking.
Yeah. So I think that there's like that possibility, but Downs doesn't have great size, and I think that teams are going to typecast him as a slot guy. And so there is some concern that he won't be able to be that productive. And, I mentioned the exact same concerns about Elijah Moore coming out, right? Because Moore had an unbelievable profile. My model liked him a good bit, but I was like, look, he seems like a slot guy. And if he's a slot guy, everything that we just talked about, there's issues over that. And then it just so happens that Moore played a ton on the perimeter as a rookie. And, some of that was squashed because we just felt better. And then I stupidly was like, yeah, okay, we can then buy into Elijah Moore now that we saw him, the first couple of games that we saw him as a rookie. We're like, yeah, let's go. We're in.
Right.
But, Downs, I just don't know if that's going to be his path. I still like him. I think he's a super, super high floor option, like a super safe option for your rookie drafts. I don't think you're going to be like upset or disappointed in drafting someone like him, but it's hard to imagine like a wide receiver one season from Josh Downs.
It is, and it's also tough. Like in best ball drafts right now, he's like decently expensive on Underdog. He's not as expensive on FFPC. He's going in the 15th round of FFPC. I believe he's the 12th round of Underdog, which is like the exact. This is a PPR slot guy.
Yeah,
like, it actually makes no sense. So he's been really tough for me to draft in these Underdog drafts. So let me close out wide receiver by asking about Quentin Johnston, because I kind of have like the high upside, high floor thing with Hyatt versus Downs. I don't even know how high Hyatt's ceiling is, but if he's fast, if he can play on the outside and he lands with a good quarterback, I think decently high ceiling.
Yeah.
But Quentin Johnston, I think, undoubtedly has a really high ceiling.
Yeah.
But man, I am worried about the floor. Seems like could have separation issues downfield. Not a great contested catch guy, despite really awesome leaping ability. I don't believe we have a 40 on him yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't work out at the combine. Didn't do the agility drills. That concerns me. Wasn't actually like very productive on screens and stuff, which is sort of like, okay, if I'm already worried about this guy, his acceleration and his quick twitch stuff, the fact that he didn't really have much efficiency there, I don't love it. I'm not going to get like too wrapped up in it, but I really want to see that work out. But at the same time, like, I don't know, he could be another T. Higgins type, and
right.
If he lands with a quarterback who's willing to chuck it up, he could be really, really fun. Whereas Jordan Addison, he seems more like kind of a Marquise Brown type of, maybe like a Emmanuel Sanders kind of thing, where you're getting like a really strong number 2 on his real life NFL team, but maybe never all that exciting of a fantasy guy.
Yeah, I agree. Addison, my comps for Addison were Calvin Ridley, who I think is a high end one, obviously. Jahan Dotson was another one, and then T.Y. Hilton was one. So I think Addison's also another guy who's not the easiest to find comps for, just given like where he's going and stuff like that. But I do think that he's a safer option than what you're going to get out of Quentin Johnston. With Johnston, yeah, I mean, like, so my production, the production that my wide receiver model looks at are best season receptions per game, best season yards per team pass attempt, and best season touchdown share. Yards per team pass attempt gets by far the most weight in that model and in the production stuff, but the other stuff is there to sort of like balance things out, if you will. If you look at first round wide receivers since 2011 that have a sub 2.5 yards per team pass attempt rate and a sub 4.5 best season receptions per game rate, you get three guys that were drafted in the first round. You get Kelvin Benjamin, Cordero Patterson, and Henry Ruggs, right? And then if you go beyond that and you look at guys who had a negative stat score, which is essentially a standardized way of looking at the stat score in the model, the three production metrics. And so that means below average, right? If you look at there's 6 wide receivers in the first round with a below average stat score. That was, again, Benjamin, Patterson, and Ruggs. So you have 3 busts. And then you have Kadarius Toney, Phillip Dorsett, and Jalen Waddle. But we know that Jalen Waddle, had the poor production profile that he had largely because he got hurt that final season before getting drafted in the top 10.
And I think played through an ankle injury, right? So like,
yeah,
he gets an extra game that doesn't really.
Yeah, but basically anytime that I'm like referencing guys in my model who like every wide receiver that broke the mold, it's basically Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Everyone else like largely follows the trends and stuff, and then those two guys just don't, and it's fine. It's not a big deal. It's just that they were abnormal prospects in the way that they sort of came about. But I don't think that he's doomed. Quentin Johnston, because if you look at the second round, you can find some comps that sort of share some similar production traits and have similar size. And some of those guys came from better draft classes. And so that's why they likely were pushed down a little bit. You can maybe say from a very loose perspective, DK Metcalf, but I think T Higgins is the one that really, really matches up to Quentin Johnston. If you were to, look more in that second round range. So my 3 comps for him were T Higgins is number 1, but then it's Alec Pierce and Brashad Perriman. So it's just kind of the range of outcomes.
Perriman one feels like too good. I don't like hearing that one.
The what one?
Perriman feels like very realistic.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it feels like
first round pick.
Yeah, right. I mean, like the big playability, the physicality is there, but just not really able to bring it all together at the next level and be that separator. And so, yeah, I mean, like I think that he's a really, really volatile prospect. More power to people if they want to put him at wide receiver 2 above Addison or have conviction and really go after it, because I do think that he has a higher ceiling. I just played a little bit safer because I think that our floor ceiling sort of equation in the way that we view players is often overstated. Like it's easy to overstate. It's easy to kind of take that too far, where, Jordan Addison, yeah, he's a higher floor option, but I would say that the ceiling for these guys in terms of like how they're going to score fantasy points, how many fantasy points per game they're going to score, probably not like so drastically different. Like it's probably not like so crazy. Like look at Jahan Dotson, look at T.Y. Hilton, these smaller guys who perform well. They maybe weren't giving you like consistent wide receiver 1 seasons, but you can get pretty consistent high end wide receiver 2 seasons from profiles like that.
Yeah, I spent like 500 words criticizing Jordan Addison's ceiling. He's my wide receiver 2.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
It's just tough with Johnston. Devontae Parker was a guy that came up for me, and that was another one that I was like, oh no. Yeah. Like that is who he is. Because it's like, yeah, Devontae Parker's pretty good at some stuff. It's just not quite to the level where, I mean, when he had Fitzpatrick that one year, it was fun. But outside of that, it's never really been that great for fantasy.
Yeah. I had Parker as a comp for Xavier Hutchinson. So it's like the same sort of like, like this like guy who might be physical, might not be able to stretch the field as much. Like Denzel Mims was another one for him. Might not be able to like truly separate despite having like some decent physical skills. So be prepared for Xavier Hutchinson to be drafted by the Patriots this year.
Oh no. All right. I really hope that happens now. All right, let's close out quickly on the tight end class. I heard you on Davis's pod, and you were mentioning like, look, man, like tight end is super hard to predict. I have the exact same feeling on tight end, where it's like, we don't predict who's going to be elite at the tight end position. We just don't do it. Travis Kelce, George Kittle, like on and on, Darren Waller, obviously. I mean that, is on and on. Mark Andrews, who's a team. The Ravens drafted 2 tight ends in that class. Hayden Hurst was the first round pick. Mark Andrews was the 3rd round pick, and then Andrews goes on to be the superstar. So it's not just us. The Ravens didn't know which guy was better. And then it's also like, we don't even know necessarily why these guys are drafting, what they're drafting these tight ends for, right? Like Darnell Washington's probably be a 1st round pick. Is it to catch a bunch of passes? Probably not. He's like an extra offensive lineman who can maybe catch passes. We'll see. So it's just really tough. At the same time, this tight end class is a little like the running back class, where there's a bunch of guys who I like taking flyers on. Like in superflex tight end premium leagues, I tend to just never spend any capital at the tight end position. I'm like, I'll figure it out. I'm not going to send you a 1st round pick for Noah Fant or whatever. Yeah. So this is a class that actually is very appealing to me because I like Sam Laporta. I like Luke Musgrave. I like flyers on Darnell Washington, actually. I think Michael Mayer's maybe not quite as buzzy as I thought he would be. Dalton Kincaid, like now we have these ultra athletic guys, Kuntz, and we have Tucker Kraft is a smaller school guy who might go in the 2nd round of the NFL draft. So there's lots of guys in this tight end class. Probably most of them will be nothing. Some of them will turn into Cole Kmet, viable starter type guys. But maybe we actually get an elite guy out of this class. What do you think?
Yeah. So, since that show, actually, this is literally developed over the last week. So I've been working on a tight end model forever. And finally things started to click over the last week and it started to work out. And I've been blasting some of my subscribers with this about, the model and just kind of walking through things. And I'm pumped because the sample size isn't very massive. That's part of the problem with tight end. I was trying to explain on that show is that, to your point, we're not very good at finding the elite tight ends is totally true. And part of the problem though, is that we only get a handful of them every decade, so what are we really modeling?
And then it's that guy forever.
Right. And so it's like, what are we really because with running back, wide receiver, we're modeling towards these guys trying to do whatever, score. For my model, it's how well they do across their first 3 years in the league. But the problem with tight end is that you're only really getting these 3 or 4 truly elite tight ends. It's really hard.
And sometimes in year 4 or 5.
Right. And it's really hard to capture that. But I will say, so this model that I'm working with goes from 2015 to now. So the sample isn't, and it's only drafted tight ends. So the sample in the the database only consists of 120 tight ends. So the sample size isn't really big for me to go out there and put in my prospect guide and have a ton of confidence about it. But I will say, I modeled it I'll just read you the top 6 tight ends. This is from 2015 to now is Kyle Pitts. This isn't in any order, but it's Kyle Pitts.
Well, the model's clearly not very good, JJ.
Yeah, exactly. Because Kyle Pitts was the 100th percentile tight end in the model. But Noah Fant, George Kittle, Mark Andrews, OJ Howard, and Evan Ingram. So it captured the dudes. It captured the guys that we're talking about here that are those super elite guys. And it's crazy because George Kittle was a late round pick. I mean, it wasn't Kittle.
A 5th round pick, right?
Yeah. So draft capital doesn't matter as much in this model that I built out as it does at running back and wide receiver, because I've realized that the model that I'm trying to build out is really to just find some of those truly elite guys, that's all I really care about. That's what anyone should care about. And so, stemming from that, I can then look at, again, I'm not publishing this like I do in the prospect guide because I'm just not there yet. There's not enough of data and stuff for this model. But I will say that this tight end class is basically the best that I've seen since 2015. Right. Yeah. Michael Mayer is looking very, very good. He's over the 90th percentile, which is a really good mark for tight ends in the model. Darnell Washington actually looks really good too. He's in the 90th. But yeah, all the guys I think Tucker Kraft is someone who really should be ranked higher places than he currently is. I mean, you have Zach Kuntz is looking really good. Laporta is looking good. Literally all of them.
I like Laporta a lot. Laporta's fun.
Laporta looks really good. So I have, in my running back and wide receiver models, I have what I call draft capital delta, which is essentially where they ranked in percentile form as prospects, and then where they ranked in percentile form in terms of draft capital, and just subtracting those two numbers. And it shows you basically if they were over or under drafted versus what the model thinks. And Laporta has one of the best draft capital deltas in this class. That's versus projected draft capital right now. So
right, that's because he's not going to get drafted high, and we're going to be sad.
Yeah,
that's
right.
That's
yeah, but he looks very, very good on paper, for sure. So, I'm not someone. I actually did an episode of my podcast earlier this week where I talked about investing in the tight end position in Dynasty and how it's generally not a great idea because they don't appreciate in value very well at all from year 1 to year 2. Like it doesn't really happen. So if you're in like a super flex league or even just a regular single quarterback league, I would shy away from drafting tight ends in the first 2 rounds. But once you get to round 3, that's when things just don't really hit very well at any position. So that's when you can start to throw more darts at this tight end class. If some of those, Laporta type players end up falling there.
Oh yeah. Laporta in round 3.
Yeah.
I'm going to be all over.
Yeah.
But even, Musgrave and Kincaid will probably be round 2, but he hasn't worked out because of a back issue. So, maybe I kind of tend to be more like if it's later in round 2, that's where the super flex tight end premium. That's where I'll start to take shots. That's where you got Freiermuth,
Yep.
All right. But JJ, thanks so much, man. This has been an incredible episode.
Yeah, man.
Incredible inaugural episode of this podcast. Tell the people where they can get the prospect guide, podcast, all of your amazing content.
Yeah. Over on lateround.com, you can just click the links at the top. You can get the prospect guide. It's $14.99. And then, my podcast link is on there as well. The Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast.
All right. Thanks so much, JJ.
Thanks, man.